Alright guys, so we are back with a brand new video, and in this video I'm going to teach you guys how to unit test your applications in NestJS. So it's actually very easy to test code in NestJS because they have a whole framework that allows you to test your code very easily. And so you don't really have to worry so much about structuring anything from the ground up. A lot of stuff is already pretty much taken care of for you. And every single time you generate a controller or a service, it'll also generate a test file along with it. And there's some written code already that it will use to just test some certain things. So we haven't written any test cases at all. But if I actually were to run the test cases, it should actually throw some errors for some of these test files. The reason why is because we actually have some dependencies from other files that we have not configured. So that's why essentially it would actually throw an error. But don't worry about that though. What I'm going to do is I'm actually going to generate a new module, and we're going to start complete from scratch. So even if you have not seen my previous videos, that's totally fine as well. We're going to basically start from scratch by creating a new module, creating a new controller and a new service, and we're going to unit test that. So I'll go ahead and just generate a module, and I'll call this, let's see, so we have customers, we have users. Let's create a module called payments. So we're going to pretend like this is a module dedicated for handling anything related with payments, okay? So we have our module, and the module file does not have its own test file, so don't worry about that. So I'll create a controller. And what we'll do is inside the controller, we will, let's see, so in NestG controller, this will go inside the, so it'll go inside the payments module, and inside the payments module, we'll have a folder called controllers, and then we will generate the files inside a subfolder inside controllers called payments. So that way, because in case if we have other controllers that might belong to the payments module, we want to put everything inside its own folder, so it looks a lot cleaner. Okay, so right off the bat, you can see that we have this payments.controller.spec.ts file. You can name your test files however you like, but you just need to make sure that it ends with the .spec.ts extension or .test.ts extension. Okay, because that's how Jest will pick up those files. Okay, you can also configure Jest to pick up certain files based on certain extensions, but we will not cover that in this video. Okay, so before we actually write any test cases, it's important for us to understand how this whole testing framework is all set up. Because if we don't understand how that works, we're going to have a hard time figuring out how to actually test. So let's go ahead and get started. So if we look at our test file, you can see that we have a very similar describe, and this is coming from the actual Jest framework itself. Okay, so we have describe block, and then we have the name of this describe, this test suite. Okay, and then we have the inside the callback function, we have our declaration. So we are declaring a variable, calling it controller, and the type is payments controller. And then what's happening here is we're using this before each function. I like to call it a hook, and basically before each, we'll call this callback function before each test. Okay, so before every single test, what will happen is we're going to go ahead and create a testing module. And basically what this does is it creates, you can think of it like creating a mock module, and you're going to provide, or not provide, but you're going to list all of the dependencies that this testing module has. So for example, our payments controller class, it requires, well, first of all, this module is going to require the payments controller. Okay, now right now we don't have any other dependencies. We only have a controller. So this is all it's going to do. And once that's done, it's going to compile everything. And once that's compiled, we can actually retrieve the actual controller from the module by calling the get method. And it's going to go ahead and give us the instance of the payments controller. So what happens then is we can actually call certain methods on that payment controller. So for example, if you actually take a look at controller dot, right now nothing's popping up because we don't have any methods. Okay, but if we were to create some methods inside the controller, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's just go ahead and do get, and we'll do get payments. Okay, and if I were to call a method on controller using the dot operator, you can see that get payments appears. So we can definitely unit test get payments. Now, one thing that I should mention that is also very important is that when you call module.get, you're really actually trying to retrieve the dependency from the actual container, because remember, NestJS is based on dependency injection. So there's a container that has all of the dependencies, okay? So that way, when it'll declare and initialize all of its dependencies during runtime, and then you can retrieve those dependencies from the container itself using dependency injection, using those decorators that we have used in the other tutorials. And basically, when you call this .get, you can see that this method actually takes in a type or a token, okay? And you can actually either pass in an actual token to retrieve the actual dependency, or you can pass in the type. So you can see right over here, what we're doing is we're passing in the type, so it's payments controller. So what happens underneath the hood is it'll actually look for the correct instance and it'll give us that controller. So let's say, for example, a good use case would be, let's say if we have two services that our payments controller has as a dependency. And let's say if we use token injection, where instead of like just using dependency injection by simply doing something like private service and then type annotating it with the service class, we use an actual token to inject it in. So when we actually set up the testing module, instead what we do is we'll actually reference a token instead of the actual type. And like I said, we'll look at a lot of examples, so don't worry. So right now, let's go ahead and write our very first unit test, because right now we haven't written any just yet. But before we do that, let's actually add some more logic to our controller. So just for demonstration purposes, what I'll do is I'm going to go ahead and let's see. We're going to go ahead and use the request and response object. So just that way we can cover how you can properly mock certain objects, because there are some times where for your controllers you might need the actual request object and the response object. So I want to show you guys how we can handle that. So let's go ahead and type annotate this as the request object with the request interface coming from the Express library. And we'll go ahead and do the same with the response object as well. Very standard way of handling requests when you come from an Express background. Okay, and I'll show you guys lots of examples, so don't worry so much, okay? So let's say get payments is going to be a function, and it requires a query parameter. Okay, so query parameters can be accessed through the request.query, okay, query object, and over here is where you can access, any parameters. So let's say, for example, inside the query parameters, let's say we have some pagination happening over here, and we want to get the query parameters counts, and let's see, let me do this. Const counts, and then we want to get the current page. So count would basically be the maximum number of entries or records that we want to return back to the user, and the page is the current page that we're on. Okay, and if you're interested in learning how to integrate pagination in your application, definitely check out one of my videos on pagination. I covered that with using Express and React. Okay, so happens both on the front and the back end. So let's say, for example, we're going to go ahead and just manually get the query parameters from this request.query object. Now, obviously, there's also the query decorator that you can use, but like I said, for demonstration purposes, I'm just going to show you guys how we can do this. Okay, so let's just say, for example, if there's no count or there's no page query parameter, we'll go ahead and we'll send back a response of 400. Okay. And we can also, let me do this. Let me do response.status 400 and send. And let's just do message. Missing count or page query parameter. Okay. So we covered that case. Now let's say if both of these parameters are there. Now we can add additional checks, but like I said, let's just keep it simple. So if we'll just assume that the query parameters that they provided are valid. So we'll just go ahead and say, let's see, response.send 200. So how do we unit test this now? Okay, so what we'll do is we'll go inside our payments.controller.spec.ts file, and what we'll do is we'll essentially, well, first let me just delete this. This should be defined. Actually, I'll leave that alone because it's good for debugging purposes. Sometimes this might actually be undefined because it failed to actually retrieve the module or retrieve the controller from the actual module. So it's good to have that around. Let's go ahead and test out our controller. So it should return a status of 400. And when you're writing your unit tests or test case in general, you want to be very descriptive, but you also don't want to write too much. So what I like to do is I like to actually create a new describe block, and then I can describe what it is I'm testing. So we're testing the get payments function, and inside this describe block, we can have all of our test cases. Okay, so you might have more than one test case for a certain function for your controller. So we're going to test the response of get payments, and we're going to make sure that it returns a 400. So the way we do this is now we're going to go ahead and reference our controller, and we're going to call it get payments. Okay. Now, right now, we need to actually pass in the appropriate arguments for this get payments method. So we can see that in the controller, get payments requires 2 parameters. Now, this requires us to actually mock out the request and the response object, and I'm going to show you guys how we can do that. So what I'll do is all the way at the top inside, you can either do this outside of the describe or inside, but I'll just do this inside. What I'll do is I will actually use a let, because we might actually modify the request and the response mock later. So I'll call this request mock. Later on, after we finish putting in the appropriate parameters, we're going to go ahead and actually pass this into an actual request object. Okay, because you'll notice that if I actually try to pass in request mock, it's going to say that this isn't the correct type. Okay, so first let me just create the objects first, and we'll leave them as empty. Okay, so request mock, and like I said, I expect you guys to have some basic understanding of Jest. Okay, so you're gonna see right over here, argument of type object is not assignable to of type request blah blah blah, and that's because we need to actually cast this into an actual request object. So what we can do is we can actually, so if we actually try to just cast this as a request using the as keyword, it's going to expect us to populate the entire object with every single required parameter. And we obviously don't want to do that because there's a lot of parameters that are required for the request. Okay, so we don't want to do that. So what we can do is we can actually just cast this as an unknown and then as a request. Okay, so this should actually, yeah, the error went away. This is just a different error saying that the request mock is never reassigned. So use const. For now, I'll just leave this as const. Okay, and we'll do the same thing too for response mock. So we'll annotate this or type annotate it as unknown first, and then we'll annotate it as a response, and we'll import the interface from the express module. And now you can see that the errors go away. And we only want to focus on providing or populating the object with the parameters or the properties that we actually need. So for example, we need to make sure that in the request object, we have the query object populated. So inside query, we can provide an empty object. Okay, now for the response, we need to make sure that we include the correct methods we need to include the correct methods that we are calling for the on the response object. If we don't, it's going to tell us that this response object does not have that specific method on that object. So you can see that in the code, it's actually going to be a little bit tricky because we were calling .status, and then we're also calling .send, and then we're also calling .send after .status. So we actually have to be a little bit careful with this. Okay, but it seems like whenever you call status, it's actually going to return the actual, or it's going to return the actual original response itself. But we'll have to play around with this just to ensure that it works. So first, let's go ahead and mock the status object or a status method on the response object. So status is going to be a mock function. So we're going to set the value of status to be a just.fn. So we'll just go ahead and take in a parameter and just return that parameter. Likewise for send, we'll do the same thing. So we'll also just do just.fn. So with just.fn, this basically is going to give us an actual mock function. And when it comes to testing your code, you don't want to mock the function that you're testing. So in our case, we're testing the get payments method. So we don't want to necessarily mock get payments. We want to actually call the method, but we want to mock any necessary functions that get payments depends on, in order for us to actually ensure that get payments is being tested. So oftentimes you might call a database, you might call some other API. You don't want to actually call those actual methods when you unit test. When it comes to end-to-end testing, you do want to do that. But unit testing is mostly focused on testing a single component and ensuring that that function gives a certain output based on some input. So, and that requires you to not call the actual database or some kind of API. And instead what you do is you provide mocks of the response of the API or of the database, and you can write certain assertions based off of that response. Now let's go ahead and write an assertion. So right now when we call get payments, we should assert that response is going to give us back a status of 400, and it's going to call .send, giving us this object, okay? So the way we do that is we can go ahead and say expect, and we can expect the response mocks.status function to have been called with 400. And let's save that, and let's go ahead and test this out. So I'm going to type yarn test, and I'm going to go ahead and type payments. So this should actually create a filter, so it'll look for the payments control.spec.ts file. So let's see. Yep, perfect. So this should pass. Let's see. So okay, so it's saying response.status.send is not a function, and like I said, the reason why this is happening is because status itself is going to return an actual object. So it's a little bit tricky. I think what we could do is we can probably, let me actually see something real quick. I wonder if you can call, yeah, so you can still call status even after you set the status, which is a little bit annoying. But what we'll do is we'll just simply, for status, we'll just simply, let's see, seems like it won't let us do that as well. Okay, you know what I'll do? I'll just, for now, for the status, we'll go ahead and just mock out send again. Okay, so this should fix it. So yeah, when we call .status, I'm not sure why it does that, but I think I actually, you know what? No, this is wrong. Instead, what we need to do is we definitely need to mock the function status itself, and the return value is going to give us back the send object. There we go, perfect. And I'll just change the variable from x to y for this send. Okay, so this should fix that issue. So let's try this again. Okay, perfect. So yeah, so status is going to obviously take in a parameter. So you can think of this x parameter as the actual status code 400, and the return value is going to give us back the response. So since I can't actually just, you know, because this is block scope, I can't actually reference response mock outside of that. Seems like now I can. I don't know, because we'll leave it alone for now. But okay, so the object that status is going to return is going to be an actual response. Okay, and I'm not going to go ahead and populate every single thing, so I'll just go ahead and just manually leave send right over here. And let's say, like I said, depending on what you call after status it's really up to you. So you might call other things after .status. So you need to make sure that you mock it appropriately. Okay, but you can see that the assertion passed. Okay, so we expected response mock.status to have been called with 400. So the nice thing about Jest is underneath the hood, it is smart enough to actually replace the actual call, and it can keep track of all of the mock calls that's being happened. So Jest will know that we're actually invoking a mock function, okay, and we can assert what it is being called with. So for example, response mock.status, we can assert that it has been called with 400, okay, and it did. Okay, it was called with 400 because we didn't have the appropriate count and page query parameters in the request.query object, and that is why it returned to 400. Let's go ahead and write one more assertion. So what we'll do, we'll go ahead and say expect, and this time we're gonna go and do response mock.status, and we should be able to let's see. So it seems like it's not gonna let us get the actual send. It's not gonna actually let us get that send property. So it's not gonna let us do that, which is kind of annoying. Because let's see. So I'm trying to think of how we can actually do this. I think another thing that we could do is we can actually. Here's what we'll do. Here's what I'll do. I'll just do a const status response mock just for now. And this status response mock will just basically be similar to the response mock. Okay. So instead of, so what we'll do instead is we'll return status response mock. So let me just delete that. Okay, so what's going to happen is it's going to return status response mock, and then it's going to call the send method or the send function on status response mock's object. So now what we can do is instead we can go ahead and write an assertion for status response mock dot send, and we can expect this to have been called with this object over here. Okay, so I'll go ahead and do to have been called with. That's an object. And let's go ahead and write our test or run our test again. And I'm going to use the test watch script. So that should run our test in watch mode. So whenever we make changes, it'll auto rerun the test again. And there we go. You can see that it passed. And if we were to just negate the value, let's say, for example, if I were to just change this to parameters, we can assure that this test should fail. So this is a good way to avoid. I'm pretty sure there's like an ESLint plugin that you can use to make sure that there's no false positives. But yeah, you can see that right over here it fails when we just change the value from parameter to parameters. And if I were to change this from 400 to 401, it should fail. Let me just rerun that again because we did that so quickly. There you go. And you can see that it expected a 401. But it gave us back a 400. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense when it comes to testing. Let's go ahead and do one more example. So I'm going to go ahead and write one more test case. And this test case should test to ensure that it returns a 200 whenever when both parameters are provided. So should return a status of 200 when query params are present. Okay, so that should do a good job at describing our test. So let me go ahead and so here's what we're going to do. We're going to have to modify the mocks. So request mock.query. I think we should be able to just modify that. Yeah. Even though it's a constant, we should be able to just modify the internal contents. We just cannot reassign a value to request mock. That's going to be an error because it's a constant. Okay, but nothing's going to stop us from actually modifying the internal content of it. So what I'll do is I'll go ahead and provide the count. So we'll do that, and then we'll do page 1. Oh, what's going on over here? Oh, it has to be a string because it's a query string. Okay, cool. So that should update the value of request mock.query. And now we can just call get payments on the controller. Pass in the request mock. We don't need to do anything with response mock, so we'll leave that alone. And now when we call this method, we can assert that response mock dot send, and like I said, you have to look at the controller and you have to look at what is happening. And it also might help is if you follow a practice called TDD, which stands for test driven development, where you write the test case first and then you implement the actual details. So it gives you a good way so you can basically base your implementation on the test case. So when you write the test case, you can ensure that this is supposed to give back a 200 or 403, and then you can write your code to fit that criteria. Okay, it's actually a practice that many companies follow along. But we can ensure that this response is going to give us back a 200. So let's go ahead and do response mock.send. It should be send. Yep. and we can go ahead and say to have been called with 200. Now, if I save, let's go ahead and let's rerun it again. Oh, whoops, didn't mean to do that. Did not mean to run all the tests, just meant to run payments. There we go. You can see that it returns a status of 200, and that test passed. If I were to pass 201, it should fail. And there we go. We can see that it expected a 201, but we received a 200. So that is how we can unit test our controllers. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. Now, in the next episode, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a part 2. Because right now we only tested a very simple case with a controller and we don't have any dependencies. But what we're going to do is we're going to create a service in the next episode. And we're going to have that service do some kind of computation. And what's going to happen is I'm going to show you guys how we can mock up the service to ensure that we are practicing actual unit testing, so we're not calling a bunch of other dependencies. So I'll show you guys how to do that in the next episode.